I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees and throwing long shadows across the dirt road. I had been driving for hours, the radio dead and the only sound the occasional hum of the tires on the rough asphalt. The GPS had been glitchy for the last 20 minutes, giving me vague directions and then recalculating like it was frustrated with me. I wasn't sure what I expected from this trip, but I wanted isolation. Just me, the forest, and a few days without the constant noise of the city. The cabin was small, almost tucked into the edge of the woods, with weathered wooden walls and a sagging roof that seemed older than I wanted to admit. The kind of place that would feel cozy in summer, but now in the cold, late December air, it seemed heavy with shadow. The door creaked louder than I expected when I opened it. Dust coated the floors in a thin, almost glittering layer, catching the last bits of light from the window. I dropped my bag and pulled off my coat, trying to ignore the cold that clung to me despite the fire I planned to make. The cabin was sparsely furnished: an old couch with one torn cushion, a small wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a single bed pushed into the corner with a thin blanket folded neatly at the foot. I unpacked my things quickly, trying not to think too much about the way the shadows stretched across the walls, twisting like dark fingers reaching toward me. The firewood was stacked in a corner, mostly dry but with a few damp logs that would smoke more than burn. I struck a match and set the smaller kindling ablaze. The fire sputtered at first but eventually caught, and the glow filled the room with a shaky warmth. I sat back on the couch, listening to the crackle and pop of the flames, trying to convince myself that I was safe. The forest outside was silent, too silent, and the longer I sat, the more I realized I could hear every tiny sound: the wind brushing the treetops, the faint thump of a branch falling somewhere in the distance, the occasional scurrying of some animal that would dart across the thin snow that had fallen. Night fell faster than I expected. The windows, old and slightly warped, reflected the firelight back at me, and I started to feel uneasy. I tried to focus on reading a book I had brought, but the words blurred. My ears kept straining for the tiniest noise. Then it started, a soft, deliberate scratching at the back door. I froze, my heart jumping into my throat. The cabin's back door led directly into a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The sound stopped, then started again, slow and methodical, like someone testing whether the door was locked. I checked the bolt. I had locked it, but my hands were shaking. My eyes followed the shadow of the doorframe, half expecting to see someone standing there. Minutes passed. Then the scratching moved along the side of the cabin. My stomach knotted. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon. This was too deliberate, too careful. I grabbed the largest knife I had brought for camping trips, my hands trembling as I approached the back window. The glass was fogged with condensation, and when I peered out, I could see nothing but the vague shapes of trees swaying in the wind. Whatever or whoever was there had vanished. Sleep was impossible. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Every snap of a branch, every whisper of wind through the old cabin made my stomach twist. Around midnight, I heard it again, a scraping, closer this time, coming from the side window that faced the forest. My breath caught, and I held perfectly still, listening as the sound circled the cabin. It was methodical, precise, like someone knew where I was. The fire had burned low, and I dragged the last logs across the floor to keep it alive. The cabin felt smaller with every minute, the shadows in the corners darker, more threatening. I realized I hadn't seen any footprints in the snow outside when I had checked earlier, but now the soft hiss of snow being brushed aside reached my ears. Someone or something was moving outside. I pressed myself against the wall near the bed, clutching the knife so tightly my knuckles whitened. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. By the time first light crept through the windows, I had convinced myself that my fear had made the sounds up. The sun made the shadows retreat, and the forest no longer looked like a trap but just trees. I decided to explore the perimeter, my knife still in hand. Snow crunched under my boots, and I scanned the edges of the clearing. That's when I saw it. Footprints, not human but too large to be a dog, circling the cabin, leaving strange, elongated impressions in the snow. They stopped abruptly at the forest line, as if whoever or whatever had made them simply disappeared into the trees. My stomach dropped. I knew now that it hadn't been my imagination. I spent the next day barricading the doors and windows as best I could. The cabin was old, the locks weak, and I had nothing to reinforce them with except furniture and rope. I took stock of the supplies I had. Food for 2 days, water, and the small survival kit I always brought on trips like this. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that the footprints could have been old. But the memory of that deliberate scratching haunted me. That night, I slept with the fire still burning, the knife under my pillow. I woke to a loud bang on the roof as if someone had thrown a heavy log. My heart slammed against my chest, and I realized the isolation I had sought had become a trap. I didn't want to panic, but I also didn't want to be naive. I knew I had to leave, and the only way was through the road that had brought me here. By morning, the snow had stopped, and the forest was quiet again. I packed my things quickly, dragging the bag across the cabin floor, making sure to take the knife. I stepped outside and froze. The footprints were back, this time leading to the road. But they weren't alone. I could see smaller, human-sized prints walking alongside the larger, strange ones. Whoever had been circling the cabin last night had returned, walking slowly toward the road. My pulse raced. I didn't have time to think. I ran, staying low, keeping my eyes on the line of trees, following the faint tire marks left in the snow. I didn't stop until I reached my car. The engine roared to life with a shaky turn of the key, and I drove off before I allowed myself to look back. The cabin receded in the rearview mirror, hidden now among the thick pine trees, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me for hours. Even when I returned to civilization with warm food and other people around, I couldn't shake the memory of the footprints, the scratching, the slow, careful steps circling the cabin like a predator testing its prey. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it to someone who didn't know the stories, and I never told anyone what happened there. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment at night, I still hear a faint scraping at the edge of the woods in my mind, and I remember the cold, the shadows, and the realization that some places are not meant to be isolated, not when something out there is patient and watching. The cabin taught me that fear isn't always about ghosts or fairy tales. Sometimes, it's about reality, the kind you can see in footprints, hear in the scratch of nails against wood, and feel in the deep, sinking knowledge that you are not alone and whatever is out there knows it. I had always loved the idea of getting away from everything, disappearing into the woods for a few days where the only sound was the wind through the trees and the occasional bird. That's why I chose the cabin at the edge of the national forest. The listing made it seem perfect. Isolated but cozy, with a small fire pit outside and a tiny stream nearby. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure with a slanted roof and a single bedroom loft, surrounded by thick pines. I drove the narrow, winding road for hours until I finally saw it, sitting there like it had been waiting for me, quiet and unassuming. I should have noticed the way the trees leaned in toward it, as if they were trying to watch me, or the way the shadows clung to the corners of the cabin even though the sun was high. The first night, I unpacked quickly and built a fire in the small metal stove inside. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and old pine sap. I'd brought some soup and bread, a notebook, a flashlight, and enough clothes for a few days. I sat on the wooden floor with my back against the wall, listening to the wind scrape through the branches outside. Everything seemed normal, almost peaceful. But there was a weight in the air, a tension I couldn't put a name to. I didn't see it at first, the little things that should have warned me. The way the front door's lock rattled even when it was latched, like something had nudged it. The footprints in the dirt around the cabin that didn't belong to me. Small, almost too deliberate. I told myself it was probably just animals. Maybe deer, maybe a raccoon. But something about them didn't feel right. They were human-sized and they circled the cabin, not darting off like wild animals would. By the second night I was more alert. I'd stayed up later trying to read, trying to ignore the creaks of the wooden floorboards and the groaning of the cabin as it settled. Around midnight I thought I heard something else. A slow, steady thump from outside, like someone was walking around with heavy boots. I froze, straining my ears, telling myself it was the wind, a falling branch. But the sound moved around the cabin, slow, deliberate. My heart started racing, but I told myself to stay calm. I had a flashlight in my hand, my phone on the table, and I could lock myself in the bedroom loft if I needed to. The third day was worse. I spent it trying to distract myself with a walk down the trail that led to the stream. The air was crisp, the water clear and cold, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like someone was following me. The thought made me tense, my stomach twisting. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed more signs. The footprints were closer, pressed into the mud right up to the steps. One of the logs I had stacked for the fire had been moved, angled slightly differently. My blood ran cold. I checked all the windows and doors, bolted and locked everything. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely light the stove for dinner. Night fell faster than I expected. I had no cell service, no signal. I was completely alone, or at least I kept telling myself I was. I stayed in the loft, trying to make a nest with my sleeping bag, hugging my knees to my chest. I listened. At first there was silence. Then slowly a scrape at the back door. I couldn't breathe. The noise came again, louder this time. Someone was trying the door. I whispered to myself that I could handle it, that I could hide, but the rational part of my brain kept screaming that hiding might not be enough. I remembered the small window by the loft. It wasn't locked from the inside, but it was high. I considered climbing out, but the drop was too far. I grabbed my flashlight and held it tight, waiting. The scrape stopped and a long, tense silence filled the cabin. My mind raced with every possibility, my heart hammering. Then I heard it. The slow crunch of footsteps walking away, leaving the back door still rattling. I stayed in the loft for hours, clutching my flashlight, listening to every crack and groan of the cabin, imagining someone circling it just outside, invisible but always there. The next morning I made a plan. I couldn't stay there another night. I packed what I could carry quickly, throwing things into my bag and leaving heavier items behind. I moved quietly, trying to avoid making any sound that might attract attention. The cabin felt alive in a way I hadn't noticed before, as if it remembered my presence and didn't want me to leave. When I stepped outside, the sun was just rising, painting the forest in orange and gold. It should have felt peaceful, but I noticed the footprints again, closer than they had ever been, pressed into the dirt like someone had been waiting for me. I ran down the trail, only half certain of the direction back to the main road. The forest seemed to close in around me. Every snapping twig made my pulse spike. I could hear the stream behind me, but it didn't matter. I kept running, forcing myself to ignore the way my legs ached and my lungs burned. The sun climbed higher, and the warmth finally made me feel like I could see clearly again. Eventually I saw the road. I slowed, almost trembling, scanning both sides of the trees for movement. There was nothing. No footprints. No shadow. Just the gravel and the forest beyond. I stumbled onto the road and waved frantically at the first car I saw. The driver stopped immediately, looking concerned. I didn't care about explanations. I just needed to leave. Later, when I returned with authorities, the cabin was empty, abandoned in every sense. There were no signs of who or what had left the footprints. The previous tenants' files were gone. No one had been living there recently. It was as if someone had been using the cabin to watch, to wait, and then disappeared when I made my escape. They never found anyone responsible, and I never stayed in a remote cabin again. But the memory never left me. The fear of those silent footsteps, the way the shadows leaned in, the knowledge that someone could be there without a sound, those things stayed with me for years. I learned to trust my instincts, to recognize the subtle signs of danger. And even now, when I drive past empty houses or isolated cabins, I feel a shiver run down my spine, remembering the time I learned that sometimes real horror doesn't come from monsters. It comes from people and the spaces they occupy, silently, patiently watching. I remember the way the forest smelled that first evening, a heavy mix of pine, wet earth, and the faint sharpness of decay. The cabin I had rented was supposed to be a quiet escape, tucked away miles from the nearest town. The directions were vague, and the GPS only brought me so far before the map pin disappeared into nothing. My car rattled over the uneven dirt road as I followed the last stretch through dense trees, the branches scraping against the windows like thin fingers. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a mix of relief and unease. It looked abandoned from the outside, its wooden planks darkened and worn, roof sagging slightly under years of neglect. The porch steps creaked as I climbed them, and the lock turned with surprising ease. Inside, the air was thick and cold, and dust motes floated in the weak light of the setting sun. The cabin smelled of old wood, mold, and faintly of something sweet and sour that made my stomach twist. I set my bag down and turned on the single ceiling light. It flickered once, then gave a steady glow. The furniture was minimal: an old table with a few chairs, a small kitchen area, a couch covered with a thin, faded blanket. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, blackened with soot, and I could see ashes still clinging to its interior. I dropped my keys on the table and tried to shake the unease from my chest, telling myself that I was alone by choice. I spent the first hour unpacking, checking the windows, locking the doors, and setting up a small space where I could sit and read. Outside, the forest was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. There were no birds, no wind rustling the leaves, just a constant low hum of silence that made my ears ache. I tried to distract myself by lighting a candle and making tea, but every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I kept telling myself it was just the cabin settling, old wood reacting to temperature and humidity. I told myself a lot of things that night. By the time I went to bed, the sun had completely disappeared. I couldn't see the trees through the window. The glass reflected only the dim light of the candle I'd left on the table. I felt the quiet press in on me from all sides. Every now and then there was a sudden snap outside, like a branch breaking, and my heart jumped. I tried to focus on my breathing, slow and steady, but sleep didn't come easily. The floorboards groaned occasionally, almost like footsteps, and I kept imagining someone was pacing just outside the door. My mind ran ahead of me in the dark, thinking of strangers wandering through the woods, hidden behind trees, watching. I woke several times during the night, convinced I had heard soft knocking at the door or scratching along the walls. I kept telling myself I was alone, that the sounds were nothing more than the old wood, the wind, or animals outside. But by 3 a.m. I was fully awake, alert, my pulse hammering in my ears. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The wind had picked up, and now there were real sounds: the rustle of leaves, the snap of branches, and a faint dragging sound, like something being pulled across the dirt outside. My stomach turned and I felt my hands shake. I grabbed the flashlight I had packed and tiptoed to the window. I didn't see anything at first, just the blackness of the forest. Then a shadow moved, quick and deliberate, across the clearing. My heart leapt and I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was upright, too large, too purposeful. I took a shaky breath and stepped back. My first instinct was to call someone, but there was no signal. Not a single bar on my phone. My sense of isolation was absolute. I spent the next hour pacing quietly, listening, peering out at the black forest. Every sound made me jump. The dragging noise started again, closer this time, circling the cabin. I could hear faint thumps, like something hitting the ground. I considered barricading the doors, but there was nothing heavy enough to move quickly. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that humans don't usually wander deep into the woods at night without purpose, and that I could see anyone approaching from the cabin. Yet the fear I felt was physical, pressing down on my chest and making my breath short and shallow. Eventually, I realized I couldn't just sit there. I needed light. I needed a way to make it clear I was here and that I was not helpless. I grabbed the small camping lantern from my bag, lit it, and positioned it near the window. I turned the knob on the stove, hoping to light a fire. Sparks caught, and the warmth from the small flame brought a flicker of relief. Outside, the shadow moved again, but it didn't come closer. I wondered if I had imagined it in my panic. Hours passed in tense waiting. I forced myself to eat a little and drink water, trying to keep my hands from shaking. Dawn finally arrived, weak and gray, casting dim light into the clearing. I crept to the window, scanning the area. Nothing was there. No tracks in the dirt, no broken branches, no sign of movement. The forest was still and quiet again. My pulse began to slow, though a knot of unease stayed in my stomach. The morning felt like a small victory. I spent the next hours checking the cabin thoroughly. All the doors were locked, the windows intact. I explored the surrounding area cautiously, finding nothing unusual, just the forest, dense and quiet. I realized then that I hadn't heard the dragging sound all night. It had stopped. Perhaps it had been an animal. Perhaps it had been a person, and they had left once they realized I was awake. I would never know. By afternoon, I allowed myself to settle back into the cabin. I started a real fire in the stove and cooked something simple. The warmth and smell of cooking food were comforting. I went outside cautiously, sticking close to the cabin, taking deep breaths of the cold air. For the first time, I noticed the beauty of the trees, the way the sunlight filtered through the branches, the quiet sparkle of frost on the ground. Fear still lingered, but it had faded from a sharp edge to a dull awareness. Over the next few days, I adapted. I checked the locks and windows multiple times a day, and I kept the fire going. Every sound made me tense, but I reminded myself to think logically. I realized that fear is louder in the mind than reality is in the world. Each night I stayed alert, but I didn't let the fear control me. I slept lightly, but I slept, and I began to enjoy the solitude. The cabin, once frightening, became a place of quiet safety. I learned to move around confidently, to trust my senses, to accept the loneliness of the forest without letting it become overwhelming. When I finally left, I drove back along the dirt road, heart lighter than it had been when I arrived. I had faced real fear, not imagined, and survived without help. I had been completely alone, truly vulnerable, yet I had endured it. The cabin behind me looked quiet, empty, almost inviting in its stillness. I knew I could return someday better prepared, and it would feel different, not terrifying, but private, solitary, and strangely comforting. Even now, months later, I remember every creak, every shadow, every tense breath. The fear was real, but so was the clarity that came after it, the knowledge that I could survive being utterly alone in a place where no one could help me. That realization, strangely, has stayed with me more than the fear itself. I had always wanted a weekend away, just me in the woods. The city had become suffocating with its constant noise, the endless lights, and the people everywhere. When I found a small cabin online hidden deep in the mountains, I thought it was perfect. The pictures made it look cozy: wooden walls, a fireplace, a little porch overlooking the trees. I didn't even check reviews. I just wanted to get away from everything for a few days. The drive up was longer than I expected. The paved road ended halfway through, and after that, it became a narrow dirt path twisting between trees and rocks. My car scraped the edges a few times, and I had to slow to a crawl to get around sharp bends. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky. Its golden light made the forest look peaceful, but I felt an odd pressure in my chest. Something about being that deep in the woods alone felt different than I imagined. The cabin was small but warm-looking. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, taking in the smell of wood and old pine. Dust covered the corners, but otherwise it was clean. There was a tiny kitchen with a stove, a small fridge and a counter, and a living area with a couch and a fireplace. Upstairs was a bedroom with a large bed and a small bathroom. I dropped my bag, unpacked quickly, and decided to explore the area before it got dark. Behind the cabin there was a narrow trail leading into the trees. It wasn't marked, just a worn path where someone must have walked before. I followed it for a few minutes, feeling the ground under my boots and listening to the forest sounds. Birds were chirping and a faint breeze rustled the leaves. But the deeper I went, the quieter it got. The birds stopped. The wind stopped. Every step seemed to echo louder than it should. I felt like I was being watched, though I kept telling myself it was just nerves. I turned back after 20 minutes, the sun sinking quickly. That night, I lit the fireplace and made myself some dinner. Outside, the forest was black, and I could hear strange noises: the cracking of branches, the rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. I tried to ignore it. I had my phone and I checked the signal. 1 bar. Enough to send a message, not enough to call. I shrugged it off. I had been here before in other remote places, and the first night was always like this. Too quiet, too many shadows. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my heart stop. It was soft at first, almost like a thump. Then another. Then another. Not a branch falling, not an animal. It was deliberate. Someone or something was moving around the cabin. I froze, straining my ears. The sounds moved from one side of the cabin to the other, careful, slow. My phone was on the table by the bed, just 1 bar, barely enough to call anyone. I considered leaving, but the car was down the hill and the driveway was hidden in darkness. I didn't know what I'd find if I went outside. I got up quietly and grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The beam cut through the dark like a knife. I moved to the living room and shined it across the windows. Nothing. The woods were still. But then I heard it again, closer this time, right outside the cabin door. My stomach sank. I could see the faint outline of footprints in the dust on the porch. They were small, careful, leading to the side of the cabin. Whoever it was, they had been watching me. I didn't panic yet. I knew if I stayed calm I could figure this out. I decided to check the windows and doors, make sure everything was locked. All doors were locked. Windows too. I sat back on the couch, keeping the flashlight in my hand, listening. Hours passed. I kept hearing soft steps, sometimes around the back, sometimes near the front. Every noise made me tense, sweat prickling my arms. I tried to think rationally, maybe it was an animal. But the steps were too light, too deliberate. Nothing in the forest moves like that. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake all night, flashlight in hand, watching the shadows. When morning came, the forest seemed normal again. Birds were chirping. Sunlight spilled into the cabin. But I was on edge, feeling like eyes were still on me. I decided to pack up and leave, but when I opened the door, I saw more footprints. They weren't animal prints. They were human, circling the cabin, sometimes stopping near the windows. My stomach twisted. Someone had been outside all night. I called the local ranger station on my weak signal, trying to explain. They told me the nearest patrolling ranger was over 30 minutes away. They advised me to stay inside, lock the doors, and keep my phone charged. I hung up, feeling more trapped than ever. I couldn't leave immediately, not without risking a confrontation. So I stayed inside, barricading the doors with chairs and whatever I could find. I sat in the living room, listening. Occasionally, I would see shadows moving outside, even when the sun was high. The forest had changed. It didn't look welcoming anymore. It looked tense, waiting. By the second night, I was exhausted. My nerves were raw. I barely ate, barely moved. And then I noticed something odd. My backpack, which I had left in the corner, was open. My water bottle was missing. Whoever had been here had been inside the cabin when I wasn't looking. My heart sank. I realized I was not just being watched. I was being studied. I wasn't safe. I started planning. I needed to get out. But the driveway was long, the woods dense. And I couldn't risk stepping outside in the dark. I decided to wait until first light. I stayed awake all night, every shadow making me flinch. By dawn, I could see the trail again. I grabbed my keys, my backpack, and my phone and quietly slipped out the back door. The forest was eerily quiet. I followed the trail, trying to keep to the higher ground where I could see anyone coming. The footsteps I had seen the night before were gone, but I could feel a presence, a tension in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The hike down to the road took hours. I had to be careful. Every branch snap, every rock that shifted under my boot made me jump. I kept scanning behind me, expecting someone to emerge from the trees. When I finally reached the dirt road, I ran. My car was still there, untouched. I locked the doors behind me and drove back to the nearest town as fast as I dared. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I never went back to that cabin. I called the local authorities and reported it, but they never found anything suspicious. No one else had rented it recently. No one had been caught in the area. It was like the whole thing had been a test. A trap set in the woods, meant to scare someone alone. I never understood why it happened, but I learned something about fear that weekend. Not the fear of ghosts or stories or shadows. Real fear, the kind that sinks into your bones, comes from knowing someone could be there, waiting, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Weeks later, I looked at the photos I had taken inside the cabin. In one corner of the living room, there was a faint mark on the floor. I hadn't noticed it at the time, but it was a smear, like someone had dragged something across the floor. I had no idea what it was. My backpack had been touched, my water bottle gone. Whoever had been there had left no trace, but I felt their presence everywhere. The forest had swallowed them again, hiding them from sight. I never went into the woods alone again. I learned to respect the silence, the isolation. And I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't supernatural. They're real, patient, and waiting. The cabin was supposed to be a weekend escape, a place to disconnect from the noise of city life. But as soon as I drove down the narrow dirt road, something felt off. The air was heavier here, damp with the smell of pine and wet soil. I parked my car in front of the small wooden cabin, its paint peeling and windows streaked with grime. The front porch sagged slightly in the middle, like it had been ignored for years. I told myself it was charming in a rustic way, but deep down, I felt a twinge of unease I couldn't shake. The door was unlocked, which made me pause. I had asked the owner to leave it open for me, but the creak of the hinges sounded sharper than expected in the quiet. I stepped inside, dragging my backpack over the threshold. Dust motes danced in the thin streams of sunlight that came through the dirty windows. The air smelled faintly of mold, old wood, and something sour I couldn't identify. The cabin was small, a single main room with a kitchenette in one corner, a rickety table and 2 chairs. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bedroom, and there was a bathroom with a cracked mirror. I set my backpack down and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. It was just an old cabin, that's all. I spent the afternoon exploring the area around the cabin. A narrow trail led into the woods behind the property, lined with ferns and fallen branches. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Birds chirped somewhere far away, but there was no wind, no movement, just a thick, almost suffocating silence. I reached a small creek and bent down to drink, the water cold and clear. I felt like I was the first person to set foot there in years. It was beautiful in a way, but the isolation started to press against me like a physical weight. I shook off the feeling, telling myself I was imagining things. As night approached, the cabin felt colder than I expected. I tried to start a fire in the tiny fireplace, but the wood was damp and the matches kept going out. I wrapped myself in the thin blanket I had brought and sat in one of the chairs, listening to the creaks of the old house settling. Every small sound made my heart jump: the wind brushing against the roof, a branch scraping the window, even the soft thud of a mouse I guessed somewhere in the walls. The cabin felt alive in a way that wasn't comforting. Then I heard it, a knock on the door. Slow, deliberate and firm. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. I told myself it was probably a branch or some animal, but the sound repeated. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't even want to move. My mind raced with possibilities, all of them bad. Whoever or whatever it was, they didn't belong here. The road was miles away and no one would be walking this late in the evening. I considered calling the police, but there was no signal. My phone had struggled to get a single bar since I'd arrived. I grabbed the baseball bat I had thrown in the corner, my hands trembling, and approached the door slowly. Another knock. My heart pounded against my chest so hard I thought it might burst. I peeked through the small crack in the curtain. There was nothing. No one. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the fear stayed. I double-checked the locks, moved a chair in front of the door and tried to sit back down. I couldn't. Every creak, every sound from outside made me flinch. I decided to wait it out until I fell asleep, hoping that would make the noises stop. Hours passed. I drifted in and out of a restless, anxious sleep. I thought I heard footsteps upstairs, though the cabin only had one floor. I thought I heard someone breathing outside the window, though I was alone in the middle of the woods. By the time the sun rose, I hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time. I was exhausted, my mind frayed and jittery from the constant tension. In the morning, I decided I had to leave. I needed daylight to feel safe. I packed my things quickly, throwing everything into my backpack, and stepped outside. That's when I noticed the tire tracks. Another car had come up the dirt road sometime during the night. The tracks ended at the edge of the trees as if someone had parked and then just vanished. I swallowed hard. My rational mind screamed that it could be nothing, maybe someone hiking, maybe a lost traveler. But my instincts screamed that it wasn't safe. I started walking toward the road, keeping my eyes on the shadows and listening for any sound. The forest seemed to close in around me, and I kept thinking I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I looked, there was nothing. My anxiety escalated with every step. It wasn't just the cabin anymore. It was the woods, the silence, the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove down the winding road, but I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone, but I felt them. Someone had been there. The thought made my stomach churn. Later, when I finally reached a small town with cell service, I called the authorities. I reported the cabin and the tire tracks. They said it had been abandoned for years, that no one should have been there, and that the area was known for occasional break-ins. The police told me it was lucky I hadn't stayed another night. Even after I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. I replayed every sound, every shadow, every creak in the cabin. I thought about the slow, deliberate knocking, the footsteps that didn't exist, the tire tracks that stopped at the tree line. I didn't know who or what had been there. I didn't want to. I never went back to the cabin. I never will. I kept a notebook of the details, writing everything down in case I needed to remember, in case someone asked. I don't think I will ever forget the feeling of being completely alone in the middle of nowhere, with someone or something watching from the shadows. It wasn't supernatural, and that made it worse. It was real. Someone had been there, and I had no idea what they wanted or why they had left without a trace. Now, I drive past forests carefully, avoiding abandoned cabins, and I never hike alone without checking in with someone. I keep pepper spray in my bag, my phone fully charged, and I always make sure there's a way out. The memory of that cabin taught me that real fear doesn't need ghosts. Real fear is silence, isolation, and the knowledge that someone could be there, hidden, watching and waiting for the right moment. The scary part is I will never know if it was just one person or a group or what they were capable of. But I do know this. The woods are quiet for a reason, the cabin was empty for a reason, and some places are not meant for people to wander alone. That weekend should have been peaceful. Instead, it became a lesson I will never forget. The fear didn't go away when I left. It traveled with me. And it's a fear that, no matter how far I drive, no matter how safe I feel, I know could be waiting for anyone foolish enough to go back. I had planned this trip for months. The idea of escaping the constant noise of the city, of waking up to the smell of pine and the distant hum of a river, felt like a necessity for my sanity. The cabin I found online was secluded, far from the nearest town, nestled deep in the forest with no neighbors for miles. The pictures showed a rustic wooden building with a stone chimney, smoke curling lazily into the morning air. I imagined waking up there, sunlight streaming through the small windows, a mug of coffee in hand, and the forest stretching endlessly around me. The drive there was longer than I expected. The narrow road twisted and turned through dense trees, the branches scraping against the car as if warning me to turn back. My GPS kept saying recalculating in loops, which only heightened the feeling of isolation. Eventually, I turned off the main road and drove down a rough dirt path, the car bouncing over hidden rocks and roots. When the cabin finally appeared, it looked even smaller than in the pictures. The paint was faded, the porch boards slightly warped, but I didn't care. It was perfect. I parked and stepped out. The forest smelled sharp and alive, a mixture of wet earth and pine needles. The only sounds were the wind brushing through the trees and the distant rush of water. I dragged my bags to the cabin and tried the door. It was stiff but gave way after a push. Inside, the air was cool and slightly musty, the wooden floorboards creaking under my weight. I set my bags down and explored. There was a small kitchen with basic appliances, a living area with a fireplace, and a bedroom with a thin mattress on a metal frame. Simple but enough. That first night, I stayed up later than I should have, the silence pressing in. It wasn't complete silence. The wind rattled the windows, branches tapped the roof, but it was quiet in a way that made every little sound sharper. I tried to read a book, but every page felt like it amplified the noises around me. At some point, I realized I hadn't locked the door properly. I got up to fix it and froze. Outside, the moonlight highlighted footprints in the dirt. I hadn't noticed them earlier, but they were fresh, leading up to the cabin's porch. My stomach sank. Whoever had been here wasn't gone long. I told myself it was probably just hikers or a neighbor checking the area, but the unease stayed. I bolted the door and double-checked the windows before crawling back into bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise, the cracking of a tree branch, the rustle of an animal made me tense. When I finally drifted off, it was only for a few hours before I woke to a strange smell. Metallic, almost like iron. I sat up, listening, but everything seemed normal. I chalked it up to imagination, but a part of me stayed alert, heart pounding. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, but there was a narrow trail that led to the river. The water was clear and cold, rushing over rocks. Birds called from the trees, and for a moment, it felt peaceful again. I collected firewood, checked the cabin's perimeter, and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone. When I returned, I noticed the footprints again, closer this time, almost circling the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. Someone had been here during the day. I made sure all the doors were locked and shoved a chair under the handle just in case. Night fell fast, the forest turning dark and heavy. I stayed in the living room, flashlight in hand, listening. At first, the noises were ordinary, the wind, small animals moving through leaves. But then I heard it. The faint sound of dragging, slow and deliberate, coming from the back of the cabin. My stomach twisted. I couldn't see anything from the window. The trees blocked the view. My first instinct was to call someone, but the phone had no signal. Panic settled over me like a cold blanket. I remembered the emergency kit in the closet, a small axe, a whistle and a flashlight. I grabbed them and quietly moved to the bedroom. Every step on the creaking floor felt loud, betraying my presence. The dragging sound stopped for a moment, then resumed, closer. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to think clearly. Whoever it was, they had circled the cabin. I could hear their movements outside, but I couldn't tell what they were doing. My heart raced, my mind spinning through scenarios, all terrifying. Hours passed like that. I didn't dare sleep. Eventually, the dragging stopped entirely, replaced by a different sound. Faint scratching at the door. Whoever or whatever it was, they were trying to get in. I held my breath, gripping the axe. The scratching intensified, then became pounding. I realized that if I didn't act, the intruder could break through. I waited until the sound paused, then bolted for the back door, praying it would open. I threw it open and ran into the forest, not looking back. I ran for what felt like forever, branches whipping at my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet. The sound of pursuit never came, but I didn't stop until I reached the main dirt road. I collapsed there, gasping, hands bleeding from the underbrush. A car appeared in the distance, a ranger. I hoped and I waved frantically. They stopped, and when I explained what happened, they radioed for backup and drove me to the nearest station. Later, the police checked the cabin. They found signs that someone had been living near it recently, makeshift bedding behind the trees, empty cans, and a small fire pit, but no one was caught. I never went back, and I refused to stay in a remote place alone again. The memory of the silence, the footsteps, the dragging sound, stayed with me for months, an unshakable reminder of how vulnerable I had been. In the end, I realized that the cabin wasn't dangerous because it was haunted or cursed. It was dangerous because it was isolated, far from help, and someone had chosen to use that isolation to watch and wait. What kept me alive was simple: awareness, preparation, and the willingness to run without hesitation. It changed how I viewed the outdoors forever. Now, when I plan trips, I double-check routes, carry emergency communication, and never underestimate the stillness of the forest. Peace can be deceptive, I learned, and danger can hide in the quietest of places. But I also learned that even in the worst situations, staying alert and trusting your instincts can get you out alive. I had always wanted to escape the city for a while, just disappear into the woods with nothing but my backpack, a journal, and a camera. I found a small cabin for rent online, far out in the forest, and it promised complete privacy. The photos were simple: a weathered wooden structure, a stone fireplace, a tiny porch overlooking dense trees. I didn't think twice. I wanted quiet, and I was willing to deal with the isolation. The drive out there was longer than I expected. The paved road ended halfway, turning into a dirt path that jostled the car with every pothole and loose stone. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, and the forest around the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The cabin itself was smaller than I thought. Paint peeled from the door, the windows were grimy, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. There was no cell signal. My heart skipped a beat, a mix of excitement and unease. I unloaded my bag, dragging it up the narrow wooden steps onto the porch. The door creaked when I opened it, and the air inside smelled musty, a mix of damp wood and old smoke. The furniture was minimal: a table with 2 chairs, a small bed, and a couch that sagged in the middle. A wood stove sat in the corner, cold and blackened from past fires. I unpacked slowly, noticing details I hadn't seen in the photos. The floorboards had gaps, and I could feel them shift under my weight. The windows rattled slightly, though there was no wind outside. I decided to settle in before nightfall. I stacked some wood in the stove, thinking I would light a fire later. I unpacked some food, water, and candles, knowing there was no electricity. Outside, the forest was quiet at first, almost too quiet. No birds, no wind, no distant sounds of animals. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat sound like a drum. As dusk fell, I lit a few candles around the cabin. Shadows danced on the walls, long and uneven. I sat on the couch, notebook in my lap, writing about the drive, the forest, the strange feeling of being completely alone. That's when I first heard it, a faint thud outside, like someone stepping on the wooden porch steps. My chest tightened. I froze. The sound didn't repeat immediately. Maybe it was a branch falling. I told myself that over and over, but the feeling in my stomach didn't ease. I got up and checked the windows. Nothing. The forest was still, darkening with the last light. I laughed nervously at myself and tried to focus on the fire I had started. The flames flickered, warming the cabin, and I tried to convince myself I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. Night came fully, and the forest around the cabin became a wall of black. Every small noise felt amplified. The wind whispered through the trees, scraping against the walls and rattling the windows. Then I heard it again, thump, thump, thump. Not on the porch this time, but inside the cabin. My stomach dropped. I ran through the cabin, checking doors and windows. Everything was locked, nothing out of place. But the sound came again, this time from the attic hatch in the corner. I had forgotten it was there. My pulse spiked, and for a moment I couldn't think. The noise was slow, deliberate, like someone climbing the stairs above. I backed away, tripping over the rug, heart hammering. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from my bag and shone it toward the attic hatch. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the wooden cover. The thumping stopped immediately. Silence. I stood frozen, barely breathing, trying to convince myself it was an animal. But the thumps hadn't been light, like an animal, too heavy, too precise. I decided to investigate carefully. I pulled the ladder down and climbed, each step groaning under my weight. The flashlight's beam bounced along the slanted walls of the attic. At first it looked empty, just dust, old boxes and cobwebs. My shoulders relaxed just a little when I noticed movement in the corner. Something shifted in the shadows. I swung the flashlight fully toward it. A raccoon trapped in one of the old boxes, its eyes reflecting the light. Relief flooded me and I laughed shakily. I climbed back down, telling myself I had been ridiculous, letting fear turn my imagination into something real. I fed the raccoon some scraps, watched it scuttle back into the trees, and tried to calm myself. The rest of the night was quiet, almost painfully so. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting by the fire with the flashlight ready, listening. Nothing came. But when morning arrived, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. The next day I explored the area around the cabin. The forest seemed alive with birds and insects, normal in every way. I hiked a little, marking my path with small stones. Everything felt peaceful under the daylight, and I told myself the fear had been a product of darkness and isolation. That night I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Around midnight I heard it again, a scraping sound outside, along the side of the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear. Footsteps? Maybe a person? I didn't know. I stayed silent, trying to gather my thoughts. Then I remembered the small cellar beneath the cabin, accessed by a hatch under the rug near the kitchen. It was locked, but the key was inside the cabin. My rational mind told me it was probably nothing, but I couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at me. I opened the hatch quietly and descended. The cellar was cold and smelled of damp earth. I swept the flashlight across the walls. Nothing. Just shelves with old jars and tools. I felt around just in case someone could hide there. But the hatch above me rattled suddenly. My heart nearly stopped. I rushed up, slammed it shut and locked it. Then I realized something. The cabin had old floorboards in the kitchen, right where the hatch was. Any intruder could have easily walked on them, hidden, and no one would know. Panic surged. I ran to the window and tried the door. It was still locked. But I had no phone signal. If someone was outside, I couldn't call for help. Hours passed, each one feeling like an eternity. I didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't leave the cabin. At first light, I gathered my courage. I opened the door slowly, peeking outside. The forest was quiet, normal. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. I climbed back in and realized something. This cabin, so remote, could be dangerous if someone with bad intentions came by. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, every creak of the floorboards making me jump. I left the cabin as quietly as possible, locking it behind me. The drive back on the dirt road felt endless. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be following me. When I finally reached the paved road, the sense of relief was overwhelming. Cell signal returned and I called a friend just to hear a voice. The forest, the cabin, the darkness, it had tested me in ways I hadn't expected. I never went back to that cabin. Weeks later, I learned that a few remote cabins in that area had been broken into, sometimes by drifters looking for shelter, sometimes by people looking for valuables. The thought chilled me, but it also made me grateful. I had left when I could and I had been safe. That trip taught me something crucial. Isolation can make ordinary things feel terrifying, but it can also make you aware of real risks you might ignore in everyday life. I still love the woods, still crave solitude sometimes, but I plan better now. I bring a fully charged phone, a GPS device, and I always check the area for signs of other people. Fear is normal, I've learned, but survival is about preparation and awareness, not imagination. And even though that cabin still haunts my memory, I sleep peacefully now, knowing I acted when I needed to and I got myself out. That clarity, that sense of control, is what made the story end well, not the forest, not the cabin, not the darkness, but the fact that I kept my wits and left before things could get worse. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was dipping behind the thick line of pines. The road leading up to it had been nothing more than a barely visible dirt track, jagged with loose stones and fallen branches, and I had to drive slowly, gripping the wheel tightly to avoid slipping. By the time I parked in the small clearing, the air was already cooling sharply, and I realized just how isolated the place truly was. The cabin itself was small, wooden, and rustic, its weathered walls almost blending into the surrounding trees. There was no cell phone signal, no sign of nearby houses, nothing but the sound of the wind brushing through the tall pines. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old wood and dust. There were basic amenities: a small stove, a metal sink, a wooden table, and 2 chairs. A narrow bed with a thin mattress sat in the corner, and a single oil lamp rested on a shelf. I had brought a bag of supplies: food, water, blankets, but nothing that could replace the uneasy feeling that settled in my chest as I looked around. I had come here to escape, to have a weekend of solitude, but now I wondered if I had underestimated just how alone I would be. The first night was strange but not terrifying. I made a small fire in the stove, ate some of the food I had brought, and wrote in my notebook until the light dimmed and my eyes grew heavy. Sleep came in fits. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside made me flinch. By the time I woke, the morning sun had barely penetrated the thick canopy outside, and the world beyond the windows seemed quiet, too quiet. I spent the day exploring the small clearing around the cabin. The woods were dense, with pine needles carpeting the ground and streams trickling in places I couldn't always see. The air smelled of wet earth and sap. I walked along a narrow path, careful not to lose my footing on the uneven terrain. Occasionally I would stop and listen. Birds called in the distance, but there were also strange, subtle noises. Twigs snapping under the weight of something moving, distant thuds, and the occasional low, rumbling echo that I couldn't place. Each sound made my stomach tighten, but I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a deer or some small animal. By the second night, unease had settled into my bones. The cabin felt smaller somehow, its walls pressing in as darkness enveloped the clearing. I had brought extra firewood, so I kept the stove burning longer than necessary, letting the warmth and light keep some of the shadow at bay. But then I noticed something odd. The food I had stored in a small cupboard seemed shifted. The cans were slightly out of place, and one of the bags of dry pasta had a small tear, the noodles scattered across the wooden floor. I couldn't explain it. I had been careful with my supplies, and no animal could have fit through the small window or the closed door. I tried to ignore it, blaming fatigue or my imagination. I ate quickly and went to bed, but sleep came reluctantly. Every noise seemed louder than the night before. A scratching at the back wall, a low thump near the front door, then silence. I held my breath, staring into the dark, convincing myself that whoever or whatever made the noise had left. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear and I fell into an uneasy sleep. The next day I decided to investigate. I examined the perimeter of the cabin, walking slowly around it, looking for signs of disturbance. That's when I saw it. Footprints in the soft soil, faint but unmistakable. They weren't animal prints. They were human, small and quick, leading from the tree line to the back of the cabin and stopping abruptly near the door. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. I went inside and checked the locks. Everything was secure. Nothing had been taken, but the realization settled like a weight in my stomach. I was not alone. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps someone had been in the area before, left footprints that had been partially washed away overnight, and maybe the noises were from wildlife. But deep down I knew that wasn't the case. The noises had been deliberate, and the signs, however subtle, pointed to someone having been very close, watching, waiting. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best as I could. I piled more firewood near the door, moved the table against it, and even blocked the windows with blankets. Every shadow now seemed like a threat, every wind gust a warning. That night was the worst. The thumps returned, louder and more frequent. Someone was moving outside, circling the cabin. The floorboards above me creaked, though there was no second story. I gripped a heavy iron pan from the stove, my knuckles white, listening as footsteps circled, paused, and then resumed. Fear was a physical presence pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I thought about calling for help, but there was no signal, no way to reach anyone. I was completely cut off. Hours passed like that until, eventually, everything went silent. I waited, trembling, afraid to move, until dawn's first light began to filter through the trees. Exhausted, I finally managed to open the door a crack and peek outside. The footprints were gone. The surrounding area looked undisturbed, as if no one had been there at all. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with a lingering unease. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, stuffing blankets, food, and supplies into my bag. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small, crude marker made of sticks and stones, placed at the edge of the clearing. It was deliberate, like a warning. My heart pounded as I realized that whoever or whatever had been there hadn't needed to enter the cabin to make its presence known. They were capable of watching, waiting, and leaving a clear message without ever confronting me directly. The drive back down the winding dirt road was tense. I kept glancing into the trees, expecting to see someone emerge, but there was nothing. So I didn't slow. I kept moving, heart racing, adrenaline keeping my hands steady on the wheel. When I finally reached the main road where I could catch a signal, I called the police and reported what had happened, though I knew they might never find anyone. I don't know exactly what it was that happened at that cabin. There were no signs of violence, no intrusions into the cabin itself, but the experience left me shaken. It taught me the depth of human cunning, how someone could invade your space in subtle ways without ever directly confronting you. And it left me with a strange mix of relief and vigilance. I had escaped unharmed, but I would never forget the sound of those footsteps circling my small, fragile shelter in the woods. Weeks later, I returned briefly with a friend to clear out the cabin. Everything looked untouched, almost serene, but the markers remained, scattered just beyond the treeline, a quiet reminder of what had been there. I never returned to that area alone. The cabin still stands, hidden among the pines, isolated, quiet, but it holds a memory I can't erase, a memory of knowing for a terrifying time that someone had been near enough to reach me, to watch me, and yet I had no way to stop it. In the end, I learned to respect the stillness of the wilderness and the unpredictability of human presence within it. The cabin wasn't haunted, nor was it cursed. It was simply a reminder that isolation makes you vulnerable, and that danger doesn't need to knock on the door to be very real. Leaving, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, knowing I had survived, that I had made it back, but also knowing I would never underestimate the quiet, waiting threat of someone hiding in plain sight again. I had been driving for hours, the kind of drive that stretches the edges of your mind and makes everything feel unreal. The road was long and thin, winding through thick pine forests that leaned over the asphalt like dark, silent watchers. I didn't even remember deciding on this trip. I think it was one of those spur-of-the-moment ideas where your mind convinces you that solitude in nature is exactly what you need. I had a map, barely, and my phone was already on low battery, which I ignored because I didn't want distractions. I pulled off the main road when I saw the small sign, "Cabin Rental, last 5 miles gravel." The road narrowed immediately and the gravel crunched sharply under my tires. The forest got darker, not just with the fading afternoon sun, but with the density of trees pressing close on both sides. The air smelled sharp and cold, like wet dirt and pine sap. The cabin itself was small, maybe 30 feet from end to end, made of rough timber that had darkened over the years. The windows were dusty and the door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside smelled like wood smoke and old dust. There were a few bare pieces of furniture. A small table with 2 chairs, a sofa that had a lumpy, worn-out cushion, and a tiny kitchen area that looked like it hadn't been used in months. The bed in the corner was covered with a thin blanket that smelled faintly of mildew. I set my bag down and tried to shake off the tension in my shoulders. I wasn't scared yet. The cabin looked abandoned, sure, but harmless. I unpacked a few things, lighting a small lamp that flickered like it didn't trust me either. I poured myself a cup of tea from the kettle and sat by the window watching the forest. The trees didn't move much, but the shadows made it feel like they were stretching toward the cabin. I felt a small thrill, the kind that makes your skin prickle. It wasn't long before the noises started. I heard a scrape at the edge of the cabin, sharp and deliberate. My heart jumped and I froze, listening. Nothing. Just the wind, or so I told myself. But then it came again, slower, heavier, like someone dragging something across the gravel. I tried to convince myself it was a branch or maybe an animal, but it sounded too precise for that. I moved cautiously to the door and peeked outside. Nothing. The forest pressed in, silent except for the occasional rustle. I stepped back, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It was like a weight pressing on my chest, and every shadow seemed to twitch with intention. I decided to stay inside and keep the lights on. I tried to busy myself, checking the cupboards, making a small fire in the stone fireplace, stacking the logs carefully. The cabin felt colder than it should, like the walls were sucking the warmth out of the room. I could see my breath forming tiny clouds in the air, and that made my skin crawl. Then I noticed the tracks. Outside, near the back of the cabin, there were footprints in the dirt. They weren't animal prints. They were human, too large for a woman, but not clearly male either. The way they led to the side of the cabin and then vanished made my stomach twist. Someone had been there, maybe recently. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the lumpy bed listening. Every sound, the wind, the creaking wood, the small scratching noises felt amplified. Around midnight I heard a knock. Soft, deliberate. I froze, eyes wide, heart hammering. Knock, knock. I didn't move. Knock, knock. Louder this time, like someone was testing me, waiting for a response. I pressed myself into the corner of the bed and waited. Eventually, the knocking stopped, but the sound of footsteps around the cabin continued. Slow pacing. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I didn't have cell service to call for help, and the nearest town was miles away. I had to leave, but when I went to the door, I realized it was locked. Not with the latch, but from the outside. Panic set in. My first thought was someone was hiding nearby, waiting to see me panic. I tried the windows, but they wouldn't budge. The cabin, once inviting, now felt like a trap. I remembered the small fireplace poker. It wasn't much, but it was something. I grabbed it and moved carefully to the door, listening. The footsteps outside were back, slow and deliberate. I held my breath. I didn't know if whoever was out there had seen me, but I had to take a risk. I threw the door open with all my strength, swinging the poker just in case. Nothing. The footprints were gone. The gravel path was empty. The forest seemed to close in more tightly than before, like it had swallowed the person or animal that had been there. I ran, my bag in hand, down the gravel road, not looking back. The run felt endless. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. After what felt like hours, I reached the main road. A truck came along and I waved frantically until it stopped. The driver stared at me like I was insane, but I managed to explain, breathless and trembling. He took me to the nearest town where I finally got cell service. I called the police and reported what had happened, but by the time officers came back with me to the cabin, it was empty. There were no tracks, no signs of forced entry, and no one had been around for miles. It took weeks for me to process what had happened. The police couldn't explain it, and friends told me I must have imagined the noises or the footprints. But I know what I felt. The fear, the cold, the sense that someone was deliberately watching me and testing me. It was real. I've avoided cabins since then. Even the thought of staying somewhere isolated makes my chest tighten and my hands shake. Now I stick to hotels in town, surrounded by people, by lights, by the constant noise of normal life. But every once in a while, when I'm driving down a quiet road, I see a small gravel path cutting into the forest, and I remember the cabin. I remember the silence, the footprints, the knocking. And I remember the cold and how it made me feel like the walls of the world were closing in. I survived, and that's the clear ending. I walked away, physically unharmed but changed. I learned that fear doesn't need monsters or ghosts. It doesn't need fairy tales. Fear can live in silence, in isolation, in the unknown presence of someone or something that's clever enough to stay hidden until you least expect it. And once you've felt it, it lingers. But I also learned to trust myself. I learned that instincts, no matter how irrational they seem to others, can save your life. That night, my fear kept me alert. My caution saved me. The ending is good because I survived, I escaped, and I carried with me a sharp awareness that keeps me safe. And while the memory of that cabin will never leave me, I've grown stronger, more careful, and more alive because of it. I had always loved being alone in the woods, especially during the winter. There was a certain peace in the quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears so heavily that even your own heartbeat sounded loud. I had rented a small cabin tucked far back in a national forest, one that was isolated enough that the nearest neighbor was a good half-hour drive away. The pictures online had made it look cozy: wooden walls, a small stone fireplace, and big windows that opened up to a view of snow-covered pines. I thought it would be the perfect place to write, to finally finish the novel I'd been struggling with for months. The first day was exactly what I had hoped for. I arrived around noon, my car crunching over the snow-packed dirt road, and unpacked slowly, letting the solitude settle around me like a blanket. I lit the fireplace and the warmth spread through the cabin, chasing away the biting cold from outside. I made a small dinner, curled up in the armchair with a notebook, and let myself sink into the comfort of being completely alone. But as the sun went down, the woods outside became a different place. Shadows stretched longer, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. I told myself it was just the quiet, the way snow muffled everything, that made the world feel off. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the notebook, writing down the lines I had been rehearsing in my head for weeks. But every now and then I would glance out the window and something would catch my eye: a movement, a shadow that didn't belong. By the second night, the wind had picked up, rattling the cabin's thin wooden walls. I had closed every window and door, yet every creak of the floorboards made me tense. I reminded myself that the cabin was old with swells and contracts, and the forest is full of animals. I told myself I was imagining things, but my heart still leapt every time the door handle shook slightly, as though someone had touched it from the outside. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. It was soft at first, almost like scraping wood on wood, but then it became a steady rhythm. My stomach dropped. I froze, straining to hear. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. Slowly, I stood up, gripping the edge of the armchair for support. I didn't have a weapon, just a small flashlight that barely illuminated the space in front of me. I moved toward the sound, every step careful, every breath shallow. When I reached the kitchen, there was nothing. The drawers were closed, the fridge hummed quietly, and the knife block was intact. My pulse thumped so loudly I was sure the sound would betray me to whoever or whatever was out there. I let the flashlight sweep across the room, the beam bouncing off the walls, over the counters, and onto the floor. Nothing. And then I saw it. A single footprint pressed into the snow outside the back door. My stomach turned icy. I hadn't gone outside, and the snow had fallen heavily since morning, covering everything. That meant whoever or whatever was out there had come in very recently. I backed away from the door and checked the locks. They were all secure, exactly as I had left them. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to catch any sound from outside. The scraping had stopped. But my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the armchair, watching the window, the beam of light slicing through the dark, until the first pale rays of dawn crept over the trees. Morning brought no comfort. The forest looked calm, as though nothing had happened, but I knew better. I didn't leave the cabin. I ate cold cereal and stared at the door, my notebook untouched. I felt trapped, even though the cabin was supposed to be my sanctuary. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe a lost hiker. Maybe someone had followed me up the road. But the thought of someone lingering near the cabin while I slept made me feel violated in a way I had never experienced before. That night, I decided to sleep with the lights on. I barricaded the door with a chair and a broom, stacking whatever I could find near the handle. I tried to keep calm, telling myself it was probably nothing, that I was overreacting. I fell asleep eventually, though every creak and snap of the old cabin kept me on edge. It wasn't until the third night that it escalated. I was writing again, trying to immerse myself in the words, when I heard a clear knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. My breath caught and I froze. The rational part of me screamed that it could be anyone, maybe a lost traveler, but the instinctive part, the part one couldn't ignore, told me it was something worse. I didn't move for what felt like hours, though in reality it was probably only a few minutes. The knocking stopped. Then, faintly, I heard footsteps circling the cabin outside. Slow, methodical steps. I realized then that running wasn't safe. There was no one around for miles. If I left, I could be confronted on the trail, and the snow made escape difficult. I remembered the small emergency radio I had brought. I turned it on, fiddled with the channels, and hoped for a signal. Static. And then, faintly, a voice. A ranger station. I froze, praying it wasn't another trick. I barely managed to speak over the crackling line, giving them my location and explaining the situation. They told me to stay inside, keep all doors locked, and that they would send someone in the morning. The night dragged on slowly. I barely slept, listening to every step, every scratch against the cabin walls. At one point I thought I saw a shadow pass the window. I gripped the flashlight like a lifeline, too terrified to look again. When the sun finally rose, I saw the first signs of help. A ranger's truck was winding down the dirt road toward the cabin. Relief washed over me, and for the first time in days I allowed myself to breathe. The rangers were thorough. They searched the surrounding woods, checked the perimeter of the cabin, and even went inside with me. There was no one. No sign of forced entry. The footprints outside were gone, likely melted in the weak winter sun. The rangers reassured me that sometimes people do follow others into the woods, and sometimes fear can make shadows move in impossible ways. They stayed until I packed my things, making sure I could drive out safely. As I left the cabin behind, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the dark tree line. Part of me expected to see someone watching, but there was only the quiet, stretching endlessly. The experience stayed with me long after I returned to the city. I never forgot the cold dread of knowing someone was outside so close and yet I couldn't see them. I never returned to that cabin. I stopped going alone to the woods even in daylight. But I did learn something. Isolation can make the mind race, make every shadow a threat, and make silence a predator. And sometimes the scariest thing is knowing you are completely exposed with no one to help and no one to trust but yourself. Even now, years later, I still remember the smell of the old wood, the sound of the snow under someone else's feet, and the absolute stillness of the night. It wasn't a fairy tale and there were no ghosts. It was real. Terrifyingly real. And I survived it, which makes it all the more vivid every time I close my eyes.